The chemotherapy bag hung above me, dripping poison into my veins to keep me alive. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Don't forget to send Vivian a congratulations gift for her exhibition. No, how are you feeling? No, we love you. Just a reminder that my sister's art show mattered more than my survival. I was 36 years old, fighting stage 2 cancer, alone, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and fear. Meanwhile, my family was 200 miles away, raising champagne glasses to celebrate Vivian's breakthrough moment. When I asked my parents to help with treatment costs from the family trust fund money my grandparents left for both of us, my father's response made my blood run cold. Vivian's opportunity can't wait. Your treatment can. They expected me to die quietly, to disappear without asking questions. They didn't know I'd already found the forged signature. They didn't know what I'd discovered about my sister's brilliant artistic philosophy. And they certainly didn't expect the investigators who would soon knock on their door. Have you ever realized your family was waiting for you to disappear? My name is Alexandra Reese. I'm 36 years old, and until 2 months ago, I was a senior project manager at a marketing firm in Boston. I built my career from nothing, bought my own condo, and never asked anyone for help. I thought that made me strong. I didn't realize it made me easy to forget. The pattern started long before the cancer. It started the day my sister Vivian was born, when I was 8 years old, and suddenly became the child who could take care of herself. I remember my college graduation like a photograph burned into memory. I walked across that stage, diploma in hand, scanning the crowd for my parents. I found them near the exit, already gathering their things. Vivian had a piano recital that evening. They left before I could find them for a single photograph. My roommate's mother hugged me instead. "You must be so proud," she said. I smiled and pretended my chest wasn't hollow. When I got promoted to senior project manager 3 years ago, I waited by my phone all evening for their call. It never came. A week later, my mother mentioned it casually over dinner. "Oh, that's nice, dear. Vivian just got accepted into that gallery showcase. Did you hear? We're so thrilled." The conversation moved on. My achievement existed for exactly one sentence. I told myself it didn't matter. I was independent, self-sufficient. I didn't need their validation, but somewhere beneath the surface, a quieter truth was forming. My family didn't overlook me by accident. They overlooked me because it was convenient. 7 years ago, Vivian almost quit art school. She called me at 2 in the morning, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. 3 rejection letters in 1 week. A professor who told her she lacked authentic vision. She wanted to give up everything. I stayed on the phone with her for 3 hours, talking her through the darkness. The next day, I wrote her a letter. A real letter, handwritten, the kind nobody sends anymore. I poured everything into those pages. My own struggles, my own moments of wanting to quit, and a metaphor I'd developed during my hardest years. Art is like waiting for winter to pass. You don't force spring to come. You prepare the soil, trust the seasons. And one morning, you wake up to find everything has changed. Vivian called me crying after she received it. She said that letter saved her life. She said she would never forget what I'd written. She never mentioned it again, not once in 7 years. I still have the draft saved in my old emails. I still have photos of the original, my handwriting filling page after page. I haven't thought about that letter in years. But sitting in this hospital waiting room, watching my savings drain away and my body betray me, I find myself remembering it with strange clarity. When I finally called my parents to tell them about the cancer, I expected fear, concern, maybe even love. What I got was silence. A long, calculating pause that stretched across the phone line like something cold and deliberate. Then my father spoke. "How much do you have in savings? How long can you manage on your own?" Not, "What's the prognosis?" Not, "What do you need?" Just questions about money and time. As if he was solving a math problem, not learning his daughter might die. My mother's voice came through, softer, but no warmer. "We'll take care of everything from the trust fund. Don't worry, Alexandra. Just focus on getting better." I cried with relief. Finally, after 36 years, they saw me. They were going to help. I didn't notice that neither of them said, "I love you." I didn't notice that they never asked what kind of cancer, or what stage, or whether I was scared. I thought that was the moment my parents finally saw me. I didn't realize they'd been planning something else entirely. 6 weeks passed after that phone call. 6 weeks of waiting. 6 weeks of excuses. Every time I called to ask about the trust fund, There was a new reason for the delay. The lawyer was reviewing paperwork. There was a processing issue with the bank. Dad was traveling and couldn't sign the documents. Mom assured me everything was fine, that I just needed to be patient. These things take time, Alexandra. You know how complicated legal matters can be. I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe them. My savings account was draining faster than the chemotherapy was draining my energy. The hospital had enrolled me in a financial assistance program, but it only covered part of the costs. Every week brought new bills. Every week I checked my account and watched the numbers shrink. Finally, I decided to stop waiting. I bought a plane ticket home without telling anyone. If they couldn't bring me the answers, I would go get them myself. When I walked through the front door of my childhood home, my parents were sitting in the living room as if they had been expecting me. No surprise on their faces, no warmth, just the practiced calm of people who had rehearsed what they were about to say. My mother gestured to the armchair across from them. "Sit down, Alexandra. We need to talk." I sat. My father cleared his throat. He didn't look at me directly. Instead, he focused on a spot somewhere above my left shoulder as he spoke. "There's been a change in how we've allocated the trust fund resources. We've used your share to invest in Vivian's future." The words didn't make sense at first. I asked him to repeat himself. He did more slowly this time, as if I were a child who couldn't understand simple English. They had used my entire share of the trust fund, nearly $200,000, to pay for Vivian's graduate program tuition, her new studio space, and what he called strategic investments in her career. I felt the room tilt. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. My mother filled the silence. "Vivian is at a critical moment in her artistic journey. This opportunity with the gallery, the graduate program, it all has a deadline. Your treatment is ongoing. It doesn't have the same urgency. You can wait a few more months until we figure something else out." She said it so calmly, so reasonably, as if she were explaining why they had rescheduled a dinner reservation instead of why they had stolen my inheritance while I was fighting for my life. "You've always been so resourceful, Alexandra," she added. "You've never needed our help before. Vivian is different. She's sensitive. She needs more support." I stared at them both, these people who raised me, these people whose approval I had chased for 36 years. They had taken my money, my grandfather's legacy to me, and given it to my sister. And they expected me to understand, to accept it, to wait quietly while cancer spread through my body because Vivian needed a bigger studio. I demanded to see the trust documents. My father hesitated, but I reminded him that I was legally entitled to copies as a beneficiary. He disappeared into his office and returned with a folder. I took it to my childhood bedroom and closed the door. For the first time in my life, I read beyond the annual summary statements, page after page of transactions, authorizations, and legal language. And then I found it, a withdrawal authorization form dated 3 weeks after I had told them about my cancer diagnosis. At the bottom was my signature, except it wasn't my signature. The handwriting was close. Someone had clearly studied how I signed my name, but the pressure was wrong. The loop on the capital A was too tight, too controlled. I signed with a looser hand, a quicker stroke. This was careful, deliberate, forged. My hands were shaking as I photographed every page. Then I found something worse. Tucked between 2 financial statements was a printed copy of a text message thread. Someone had forwarded it and forgotten to remove it from the file. The messages were between Vivian and my parents, sent the day after I called to tell them about my cancer. Vivian's message read, "She's going to ask about the trust soon. We should finalize everything before her next doctor's appointment." My father's response, "Already working on it." I read those words 3 times, 4 times, 5. They blurred through my tears, but never changed their meaning. This wasn't a panicked decision made under pressure. This wasn't parents making a difficult choice in the moment. This was coordinated, planned, executed with precision while I sat in a hospital gown waiting for test results. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my childhood bed, the same bed where I had once dreamed of making my parents proud, and I scrolled through Vivian's Instagram. Her exhibition opening had been the previous weekend. The photos showed her in a flowing silk dress, champagne glass in hand, surrounded by admirers and art critics. In one photo, my parents stood on either side of her, beaming with pride I had never seen directed at me. The caption read, "Family is my greatest inspiration." Everything I create comes from the love and support that shaped me. 300 comments praised her unique artistic voice, her profound philosophy about patience and transformation. Several people quoted her artist statement. I clicked through to read the full text on the gallery's website. The words made me stop breathing. My work explores the tension between waiting and becoming. Like winter passing into spring, we cannot force transformation. We can only prepare the soil, trust the seasons, and wake one morning to find that everything has changed. Something cold moved through my chest, those words, that metaphor, the soil, the seasons, the waiting. I knew those words. I had written those words 7 years ago in a letter to my sister when she wanted to quit art school. My words, my philosophy, my metaphor born from my own years of struggle. She had taken them. She had built her entire artistic identity on sentences I wrote to save her from despair. I couldn't sleep. I started searching for anything I could find about Vivian's early life, her education, the foundation of her career. I found an old article about her middle school listing the faculty members from that year. One name caught my attention. Elaine Holloway, art teacher, retired 10 years ago. I found Mrs. Holloway on LinkedIn. Her profile showed a woman in her late 60s now living in a small town 2 hours away. On impulse, I sent her a message. I told her I was Vivian Reese's sister, that I was looking into some questions about my sister's early art education, and I asked if she would be willing to speak with me. I didn't expect a response. Retired teachers don't usually want to discuss students from 15 years ago, but at 6 in the morning my phone buzzed. Mrs. Holloway had replied. Her message was only one sentence long, but it changed everything. I've been wondering when someone would finally ask, "Call me." I sat in the gray morning light staring at those words. Something had happened. Something that Mrs. Holloway had been carrying for 15 years. Something she had been waiting to tell someone. For the first time, I stopped asking why my parents didn't love me enough. I started asking a different question, a harder question, a question that made the betrayal about the money seem almost small by comparison. How long had they been planning this? And what else had they been hiding? I called Mrs. Holloway the moment the sun came up. What I expected was a brief conversation, maybe a few memories from 15 years ago. What I got was a 2-hour education in exactly who my sister really was. Mrs. Holloway remembered everything. Her voice was steady, the voice of a woman who had been carrying a weight for a long time and was finally ready to set it down. She told me that 15 years ago, when Vivian was 13 years old, she plagiarized an entire art project. Not a few ideas, not a borrowed concept. She copied another student's work almost line for line, changing only enough to make it look slightly different. When Mrs. Holloway confronted her, Vivian burst into tears and claimed she didn't understand the assignment. She said she thought she was allowed to use references. She played the confused, sensitive child perfectly. Mrs. Holloway didn't buy it. She reported the incident to the principal and recommended that Vivian receive a failing grade on the project and a formal warning in her academic record. 1 week later, Mrs. Holloway was called into a meeting. The principal was there. So was my father, Richard Reese. My father offered to donate new computers to the art department. A generous gift, he called it. His only request was that the matter be handled quietly, that Vivian's record remain clean, that the incident be treated as a simple misunderstanding. The principal agreed before Mrs. Holloway could object. The paperwork disappeared. Vivian's record stayed spotless. But Mrs. Holloway refused to destroy her own documentation. She kept copies of everything. The original project, the student's work that Vivian had copied, her own written report about the incident. She kept them in a box in her garage for 15 years. I kept those files because I was angry, she told me. They tried to pay me off, but I wouldn't let them erase what that girl did. It was my small rebellion. I never thought anyone would care enough to ask. Then she told me something that made my blood run cold. 3 months ago, Vivian had shown up at her door. She claimed she wanted to reconnect with her old teacher to thank her for inspiring her love of art, but the visit quickly turned strange. Vivian kept asking questions about what records Mrs. Holloway might have kept from her teaching years. Did she still have old student files? Had she ever thrown anything away? She was nervous, Mrs. Holloway said. Jumpy, scared of something. I think I know what she was scared of now, Mrs. Holloway said. She was scared of you. Scared that someday you would start asking questions. There was one more thing. Mrs. Holloway had stayed connected to the art education community after her retirement. 5 years ago, she heard a rumor about Vivian. A young artist barely 22 years old had accused Vivian of stealing the concept for her breakthrough piece, the piece that launched Vivian's career, the piece that got her noticed by the gallery that now represented her. The young artist had evidence, sketches, dated notebooks, witnesses who had seen her working on the concept months before Vivian unveiled her version, but the accusation never went public. The young artist suddenly stopped talking. She deleted her social media. She disappeared from the art scene entirely. Mrs. Holloway did some digging and discovered why. The young woman had been paid $50,000 to sign a non-disclosure agreement. "My family bought her silence. She might talk to you now," Mrs. Holloway said, "if she knows she's not alone." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment for a long time. My body was weak from the treatments, but my mind had never been clearer. I opened my laptop and searched through my old emails until I found what I was looking for: the draft of the letter I had written to Vivian 7 years ago. The letter that saved her, she said. The letter she never mentioned again. Then I opened a new tab and pulled up Vivian's artist statement from the gallery website. I put the two documents side by side on my screen, and I read them together line by line. My heart stopped. The theft wasn't word for word. Vivian was too smart for that. But the framework was unmistakable. My metaphor about winter passing, about not forcing spring to come, appeared in her statement as the patient stillness before transformation. My philosophy about preparing the soil became her tending the internal garden. My words about waking one morning to find everything changed became her the sudden recognition that growth has already happened. Every major theme, every distinctive image, every emotional core of her artistic philosophy. It all came from my letter, the letter I wrote at 2 a.m. to save my sister from despair. The letter I poured my own struggles into, my own hard-won wisdom, my own years of learning how to survive. Vivian didn't just steal an idea, she stole my voice. She built an entire career by wearing my words as a mask, and no one ever knew because I was too invisible for anyone to notice. 2 days later, my parents called an emergency family meeting. They said it was important that we needed to discuss the future. Part of me hoped this was the moment they would apologize, the moment they would explain, the moment they would finally see what they had done. I flew back home. I sat in the same living room where they had told me my inheritance was gone. This time, there were documents on the coffee table, legal documents. My father explained that they wanted to simplify the estate planning. Given my health situation, he said it made sense to streamline things now rather than deal with complications later. He pushed the papers toward me. A complete waiver of all my inheritance rights. In exchange, I would receive a small settlement, enough to cover maybe 3 months of treatment, then nothing. I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at my father. He stared at me with the patience of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. Then Vivian spoke. She had been sitting in the corner, silent until now. Her voice was cold, matter of fact. The voice of someone discussing quarterly earnings, not her sister's life. "Let's be realistic, Alexandra. Your diagnosis isn't good. Your treatment isn't working. You don't have a future here. Don't drag this family down with you. Sign the papers, take the settlement, and let us all move on." The room was silent. My parents didn't object. They didn't flinch. They didn't tell Vivian that was too harsh or ask her to show some compassion. Because this was her idea. This meeting, these documents, this final push to erase me from the family. She had planned it, and they had agreed before I ever walked through the door. I didn't sign. I stood up without saying a word. I walked out of that house. I drove to the airport. I flew home. And I stayed awake until 4 a.m, preparing everything I needed to send. At 4:17 a.m., I sent 3 messages. The first was an email to the ethics committee at Vivian's graduate school. I attached my original letter draft with its timestamps from 7 years ago, Vivian's artist statements, and a detailed side-by-side analysis showing exactly how she had stolen my words. The second was an email to the gallery representing Vivian. I attached Mrs. Holloway's written testimony about the plagiarism incident from 15 years ago, and I included the name of the young artist who had been paid to sign the NDA. The third was a voicemail to a former colleague of mine who now worked at a law firm specializing in financial crimes. I said I needed to report fraud against a family trust, forged signatures, stolen inheritance. I said I had documentation. I asked her to call me back. I didn't send those messages for revenge. I sent them because I finally understood the truth. My family wasn't just neglecting me. They weren't just favoring Vivian. They were waiting for me to disappear. They had calculated my death into their plans, and they expected me to cooperate by dying quietly. But I wasn't going to disappear. Not anymore. 5 weeks passed after I sent those messages. 5 weeks of waiting while the wheels of justice slowly began to turn. During that time, I focused on one thing: staying alive. A patient advocacy organization helped me secure better treatment options. They connected me with doctors who specialized in my type of cancer, and they helped me navigate the financial maze of medical care without insurance. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt like I had people in my corner, not family, not blood relatives who were supposed to love me unconditionally, just kind strangers who believed that everyone deserved a chance to fight for their life. While I was fighting, my family's world was beginning to crumble. The first domino fell at Vivian's graduate school. The ethics committee opened a formal investigation within days of receiving my email. They were thorough. They contacted Mrs. Holloway, who provided her written testimony and the documentation she had kept for 15 years. They reached out to the young artist who had signed the NDA 5 years ago. Her name was Caroline, and she had been silent for so long because she believed no one would ever believe her over the great Vivian Reese. But when she learned she wasn't alone, when she understood that there was a pattern of theft stretching back to Vivian's childhood, she agreed to provide a statement. It turned out that NDAs couldn't prevent someone from cooperating with academic ethics investigations. The contract my family paid for was worthless when it mattered most. The evidence was undeniable. My time-stamped letter draft from 7 years ago, Vivian's artist statements that echoed my words, Mrs. Holloway's records from the plagiarism incident when Vivian was 13, Caroline's sketches and dated notebooks proving she had developed the concept for Vivian's breakthrough piece months before Vivian claimed it as her own. The ethics committee didn't need to deliberate for long. The gallery that represented Vivian suspended their relationship with her pending review. That was the polite way of saying they were done with her forever. Within a week, 3 collectors who had purchased Vivian's work contacted the gallery demanding refunds. They cited misrepresentation. They said they had paid premium prices for pieces by an artist with a unique philosophical vision, and now they discovered that vision was stolen. The gallery bore that liability, not Vivian directly, but the message spread through the art community like wildfire. There was no dramatic public scandal, no headlines, no viral social media takedowns, just doors closing one by one permanently. Invitations to exhibitions stopped arriving. Critics who had praised Vivian's profound artistic voice went silent. Collectors who had invested in her work quietly removed her pieces from their walls. Vivian's Instagram account went private. A few days later, the account disappeared entirely. The career she had built on stolen ideas was collapsing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But the art world consequences were only the beginning. The real devastation came from the financial crimes investigation. My former colleague at the law firm had taken my case seriously. She helped me file a formal complaint with the district attorney's financial crimes division. Investigators subpoenaed the trust fund records and all family communications related to the trust. What they found went far beyond the forged signature. They recovered email correspondence between my parents discussing their plans. My father had consulted an estate planning attorney about what he called expedited restructuring of the trust. In one email, he specifically asked what would happen to my share of the trust if my condition became terminal. He wanted to know how quickly they could consolidate the funds. He wanted to know if there would be any legal complications if I died before the restructuring was complete. They found a spreadsheet on my father's computer. The file was titled Post-A Scenarios. The A stood for Alexandra. For me, the spreadsheet contained financial projections based on different timelines. One column calculated the family's net worth if I died within 6 months. Another column projected the numbers if I survived a year. A third column showed what would happen if I went into remission. My father, the retired accountant, had run the numbers on my death. He had treated my life like a variable in an equation. They also found a calendar entry for a meeting with a wealth advisor. The meeting was scheduled for the week after my first chemotherapy treatment. The subject line read, Trust Consolidation Time Sensitive. When the investigators showed me this evidence, I couldn't speak for a long time. I I had known my parents didn't love me the way they loved Vivian. I had accepted that painful truth years ago. But this was different. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't favoritism. This was calculation. They had built a financial plan around the possibility of my death. They had hoped I would die quickly and quietly so they could keep the money they had already stolen. Justice arrived in different forms for different crimes. My father, Richard Reese, was charged with forgery, embezzlement, and fraud. Given his age, his lack of prior criminal record, and his willingness to cooperate with the investigation, the prosecutor offered a plea deal. He accepted 18 months in state prison, 5 years of probation after his release, full restitution of everything he had stolen from me plus damages. My mother's involvement was less direct, but still criminal. She had known about the forgery. She had participated in the planning. She had benefited from the theft. But she hadn't personally forged any documents, and she cooperated fully with investigators. She received 12 months of home confinement and 5 years of probation. She would spend the next year trapped in the house she had always been so proud of, wearing an ankle monitor, unable to attend the social events that had defined her identity. Vivian's situation was more complicated. Criminal conspiracy charges require specific evidence of agreement to commit crimes. Her text message about finalizing things before my doctor's appointment was damaging, but it wasn't quite enough to prove she had agreed to the forgery itself. She had known what was happening. She had benefited from it. She had encouraged it, but she hadn't physically committed the crimes, and that distinction mattered in court. She avoided criminal charges, but she couldn't avoid civil liability. The settlement required her to pay damages to me and to Caroline, the artist whose work she had stolen 5 years ago. Combined with the loss of her scholarship, her gallery representation, and her professional reputation, she was left with nothing. The empire she had built on stolen words and stolen ideas had collapsed entirely. The week before my father reported to prison, my mother called me. The house was already on the market. They needed to sell it to pay the legal fees and settlements. Her voice was thick with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of self-pity. "Are you satisfied now?" she demanded. "You've destroyed everything we built. This family is finished because of you." I listened to her blame me for the consequences of their own actions. I let her finish. Then I responded, my voice quiet but firm. "You planned for my death while I was in chemotherapy. You calculated what my inheritance would be worth if I didn't survive. You made spreadsheets about how much money you would have when I was gone. You don't get to be the victim, Mom. Not anymore." Silence on the line. Then my father's voice in the background, distant but audible. It was the first time he had spoken directly to me in months. "We made a mistake in how we handled things. If we could go back," I interrupted him. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a plan. Those are different things. A mistake is forgetting a birthday. A mistake is saying something hurtful in the heat of an argument. What you did was deliberate. You studied my signature so you could forge it. You calculated different scenarios based on when I might die. You scheduled meetings with wealth advisors while I was vomiting from chemotherapy. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. A series of choices. And now you have to live with the consequences." I hung up the phone. It was the last conversation I ever had with either of my parents. They apologized for getting caught. They apologized for how things had turned out. They apologized for the situation as if it were something that had happened to them rather than something they had created, but they never apologized for the plan. They never said they were sorry for deciding that my life was worth less than my sister's career. They never admitted that what they did was wrong. And I realized finally that they never would. 8 months have passed since that final phone call with my parents. 8 months since I realized they would never truly apologize for what they did to me. And in those 8 months, everything has changed. My latest scans came back last week. The doctor smiled when she walked into the room, and I knew before she said a word. The treatment is working. The cancer is responding. She used words like cautiously optimistic and continued monitoring, but what I heard was, "You are going to live." After everything my family did to make my survival harder, after they stole my money and planned for my death, I am going to live anyway. I moved to a new city 3 months ago. Not running away, starting fresh. I found a small apartment with big windows that let in the morning sun. I work as a freelance marketing consultant, now helping small businesses tell their stories. I choose my own clients. I set my own hours. I answer to no one but myself. There's something fitting about this work helping people find their authentic voices. Maybe because I spent so many years losing my own. Once a month, I speak at a support group for adults who are estranged from their families. I'm not an expert. I don't have training or credentials. I'm just someone walking the same road they are a few steps ahead on some days, a few steps behind on others. Last week, a woman in her 50s asked me how I stopped feeling guilty for cutting off my parents. I told her the truth. I used to think being cut off from family was the worst thing that could happen. I used to believe that no matter how badly they treated me, I should keep trying, keep forgiving, keep showing up, because that's what family does. But I understand now that being cut off from yourself, self, is worse. And some families require you to do exactly that to stay connected to them. They require you to shrink, to accept less, to pretend you don't see what's happening right in front of you. I couldn't do that anymore. And neither should you. She cried. I held her hand. I remembered being exactly where she was torn between loyalty and survival. I'm grateful I chose survival. My family is living with the consequences of their choices now. My father is serving his sentence in a minimum security facility. With good behavior, he'll be released in 14 months. I don't think about what happens when he gets out. It doesn't concern me anymore. My mother lives alone in a small apartment on the other side of the country. Her social standing is destroyed. The women she used to play bridge with stopped returning her calls. The charity board she sat on quietly removed her name. The house where I grew up, where I was systematically overlooked for 3 decades, sold to a young family with 2 children. They know nothing about the history of those walls. They'll fill the rooms with laughter and birthday parties and bedtime stories. Maybe that house will finally know what a real family looks like. Vivian's situation is more complicated. She lost everything she built on lies. Her scholarship, her gallery representation, her reputation in the art world. But she's not destroyed. She teaches children's art classes at a community center now. She takes small commissions for local businesses, painting murals and designing logos. Whether she's learned anything from what happened, whether she feels genuine remorse, or is simply rebuilding her mask in a new location, I don't know. I don't care to find out. Some questions don't need answers. Some people don't deserve the space they take up in your mind. Last month, I did something I had been meaning to do for a long time. I drove 2 hours to visit Mrs. Holloway in person. The retired teacher who kept her records for 15 years, the woman who refused to let my family buy her silence. I had only known her through phone calls and emails, and I wanted to thank her face to face. She lives in a small house filled with artwork from 40 years of teaching. Paintings and drawings and sculptures covered every wall. And surface. Some pieces were sophisticated, clearly made by talented students who went on to serious careers. Others were simple, childish, the kind of art that only a teacher would save. She kept them all. We sat in her kitchen and drank tea while she told me stories about her teaching years. Then she grew quiet and looked at me with those sharp, kind eyes. I kept those records for 15 years because I was angry, she said. Your family tried to pay me off and I refused to let them win. But I think I was also waiting. Waiting to see if the truth would ever matter to anyone. Waiting to see if someone would finally ask the right questions. She paused. I'm glad it was you. Before I left, she gave me a small painting. Her own work, not a student's. It showed a single tree in winter, bare branches reaching up against a gray sky. But if you look closely, really closely, you can see tiny buds forming on the branches. Small green promises of what's coming. For your new apartment, she said. To remind you that winter always ends. That painting hangs above my desk now. I look at it every morning when I start my work. It reminds me of what I survived and what's still ahead. This morning, I did something I haven't done in years. I sat down at my desk with a piece of real paper and a pen, and I wrote a letter. Not to Vivian, not to my parents, to myself. I wrote about perseverance, about worth, about preparing the soil and trusting the seasons, about the difference between being strong for others and being strong for yourself. These were the same themes I had given away 7 years ago, the words my sister weaponized and wore as a mask. But these words are different. These words know what I've survived. These words belong to no one but me. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer. Not hidden, but private. No one else will ever read it. It's mine. I didn't win by destroying my family. I won by surviving their plan. I didn't seek revenge, I sought the truth. And when the truth came out, consequences followed. Not because I orchestrated them, but because that's what happens when lies are exposed to light. The truth has its own weight. It doesn't need my help to fall. My mother asked if I was satisfied. The answer is complicated. I'm not happy about what happened. I never wanted any of this. But I am at peace with what I did. I am at peace with who I've become. People sometimes ask if I will ever forgive my parents and my sister. I tell them the same thing every time. Forgiveness is for people who are sorry. My family is only sorry they got caught. And I've learned something important over these past months. You don't have to forgive someone to move on. You just have to stop letting them define your worth. My father will leave prison eventually. My mother will finish her home confinement. My sister will keep teaching children to paint. And I will keep living. Not in spite of them, completely independent of them. Building a life they have no part in. Becoming someone they never thought I could be. That I decided was the only victory that mattered. Alexandra's story reminds us of something we often forget. Family is supposed to be a source of love and support, not a place where your worth is measured against someone else's. Not every family treats its members equally, and not every family deserves your loyalty simply because you share the same blood. If you recognize yourself in Alexandra's story, if you have ever felt invisible in your own family, if you have ever been told that your needs could wait while someone else's dreams came first, I want you to know something important. You are not wrong for feeling hurt. You are not selfish for wanting to be seen. And you are not obligated to keep giving pieces of yourself to people who only take. There are lessons in this story that apply to all of us. The first lesson is this: trust, but verify. Alexandra trusted her parents with her inheritance, and that trust was used against her. Protecting yourself is not the same as being suspicious. It is being wise. The second lesson is about the power of documentation. Mrs. Holloway kept her records for 15 years because she refused to let the truth be erased. Alexandra found her old letter drafts in her emails. These pieces of evidence became the foundation for justice. Keep records. Save important documents. You never know when the truth will need proof. The third lesson is perhaps the most important one. You do not have to forgive someone to move forward with your life. Alexandra did not forgive her family. She simply stopped letting them define her worth. She focused on building a life that had nothing to do with them. And she found peace not through forgiveness, but through freedom. Finally, remember that seeking justice is not the same as seeking revenge. Alexandra did not destroy her family out of anger. She simply told the truth and let the consequences follow. You do not have to orchestrate someone's downfall. You only have to stop protecting them from the truth. If this story touched your heart, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever felt invisible in your family? Have you ever had to choose between loyalty and self-respect? Your stories matter, and this community is a place where you can share them safely. If you are new to this channel, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss a story. Your subscription helps us continue creating content that speaks to real experiences and real emotions. Thank you for listening to Alexandra's story, and remember, your worth is not determined by how your family treats you. Your worth is determined by how you treat yourself. Until next time, take care of your heart.